welcome to another edition of Chicago Crossing Train Talk. Eric here with you. And today I am thinking about windows. And you may wonder, why are you thinking about windows? Well, part of it is because the windows of the Cassidy Tire building are actually one of the key areas that I'm spending time renovating in order to help tell the story of that building. You know, if it weren't for model railroading, I suppose my most frequent hobby would probably be looking at Google Maps and historical images of Chicago buildings. You know, you can take the kid out of Chicago, but you can't take Chicago out of the kid. And so if I'm not there in person, certainly I'm spending a lot of time revisiting that city in the time period that I'm trying to model in order to better understand how the built environment tells a story, and then how to transfer some of that information into the built environment that I make for Chicago Crossing Model Railroad. Something that I've recognized is that the windows of a building offer a wealth of clues about not only the building itself, but also the individuals who inhabit the building, either for work or for living, about the neighborhood that that building is in, about the nature of the business that's there, about the age of the building, and about how the use of that building has changed over time. And all of those clues are essentially just add-ons to the model kits or scratch builds that we have already built. You know, in Chicago Crossing, most of the buildings date from probably the teens and 20s, with a few that would probably date from the late 19th century to early 20th century. You know, this building is an excellent example of late 19th century or even mid 19th century architecture. And what you can see here, this is basically the building that stands in for Finkel Steel until I get a kit, or not a kit bash, but a scratch build together, is this building is nicely built, it's nicely painted, it's even, you know, decently weathered. And aside from the fact that it fills in space and that it looks like a building, it offers virtually nothing in terms of the story of Chicago Crossing or in terms of the story of the neighborhood. You know, you look at this building and this might as well be how it looked in 1885. This is not how it would look in 1997. And certainly it doesn't really represent how Finkel Steel looked in 1997. And part of that reason is this building has not been modified at all from its original construction. I mean, it still has 5-panel doors. It still has wooden sliding doors and an upper loft door here, has the same sash windows as it was built with. And, you know, it's certainly possible for a historic building to retain some of these features. But for an active steel foundry to retain the original wooden frame windows that it was built with, I think that's probably unlikely. You know, likewise, there's no unbroken or replaced windows in the clerestory roof here. So when this building occupies the layout, it does just that and really nothing more. It doesn't tell you a story about where that building's been, how that building gets used, and what that building is doing now. And so that lack of visual narrative really just kind of creates a hole in the layout where you can say, yeah, there's something there, but how rich is the story that it actually tells your viewers or even you? And so part of the strategy from my standpoint, and this is just me, is in order for a building to tell a story, first you have to tell the story of the building in your own mind. And then you have to identify the ways to communicate that story to others based on the way that that building is constructed or modified. You know, a great way of using windows to tell a story for a building is actually for this currency exchange building here. And, you know, this was originally a fairly nondescript turreted building that just occupied space in the south side neighborhood of the layout. And, you know, what I did is I progressively modified it over time to the point where the building offers a wealth of clues as to the neighborhood, to the state of the building, and to the narrative or story of that neighborhood. Here's an example. Up on the upper floors of this building, even if you were to wipe away the light up currency exchange signs and the concert posters and all that sort of stuff, the boarded up windows here already tell you quite a number of clues about this particular neighborhood and this particular building. Board ups like this are actually quite common, particularly in economically depressed neighborhoods in Chicago and elsewhere, and even in rural areas. Typically what it means is that it's no longer economical to rent out or use the upper stories. There may be zoning or fire code issues or other things like that. There may be a need to do extensive renovations in order to keep it up to those codes that simply are not worth doing. And so at that point, windows like this get boarded up. And what that creates is an absence of what Jane Jacobs had defined as eyes on the street. In this way, between the boarded up windows and all the burglar bars and burglar cage screens over these windows, it really tells you a lot about not only the function of this building, even if the currency exchange signs weren't there, but it also tells you a lot about the neighborhood that building is in. And those visual clues then help to essentially set the stage for the rest of the story, which is defined based on the currency exchange signage, the worn over concert posters and stuff like that. In industrial settings, windows serve a lot of different purposes. Originally, these buildings were built with large windows in order to let in significant amounts of light. This building here would probably date in terms of prototype to most likely around World War I, maybe a little bit before, possibly a little bit after in the 20s. It's another one of these somewhat neo-Gothic Art Deco structures. Once again, I built this building more or less according to the kit instructions. The difference for this one is that I actually managed to take a very, very thin marker and color in all of the window panes. And what you can see here is that I also put multicolored patches on windows where some of the panes were broken. And I think this gets part of the way. I think a lot of people do this, and it gets part of the way towards describing the age of the building and helping somebody to understand a little bit more about the circumstances of this building. But I think in general, one might argue, yeah, this building is pretty well maintained, aside from some expediency and really no interest in replacing glass with glass. It looks pretty good, and it looks in pretty good shape. From that perspective, I think there's a few things that you learn really quickly when you look at industrial buildings, particularly when they're just your average run-of-the-mill, non-landmark building that is still in use. And, one of the key things you learn is the idea of a high-quality repair that makes the building look just as good as it looked the day that it opened and was built is basically out of this world. Nobody does that. So if somebody's going to cover up a window, they're not going to try to match the original brick that was there if they're using brick. They may not even use brick, particularly if this is a post-war, or even 1970s, 1980s reconstruction. They may do something completely different. So the materials are almost never going to match the original. And a lot of us, when we have kits that come with things like optional window blankings, like little pieces of brick that you can put in there, sometimes we'll just paint it the same color. That would be relatively rare. I've actually got an abandoned structure on my layout where I did just that back in the day. I actually painted the window blanking basically the same color as the rest of the building. But that would never match prototype. It's whatever brick you have around. And you see this over and over again on industrial buildings. The second is most of these structures were built prior to high-grade HVAC, air handling, and things like that. These windows often serve as really convenient places to stash vents because it's an easily accessible opening in the building. And then all you have to do is insulate around it. And in some cases, you'll see vents that actually snake from the building over here up to the top. Maybe there's an air handling unit in there and it moves onto the roof. Or even vice versa. Maybe from this unit, there's a duct that comes down and blows directly into here. You end up having cutouts of some windows for vent fans and other things like that based on how the building changes over time. So windows also simply become openings for all sorts of other stuff that's just put in ad hoc. Again, not with much regard to the building's appearance, because these buildings outside of their original architectural shell are pure functionality. And for whatever company is using them, that's mostly what they're concerned about. They're not concerned about aesthetics. And then the third is basically, just safety and security. And in some cases, or expediency because of vandalism or window breakage. In cases like that, in a certain neighborhood, maybe it's better to actually take these windows out if they get rocks thrown at them or something like that, and to replace it with cinder block, a more modern construction material that can be very easily placed into this area. And then maybe there's just a tiny remnant of a window just for a modicum of light. With all of that in mind, what are the different ways that we can, modify these from a practical sense? And, there's a lot of different materials out there. I think, I and you and everybody probably have the usual compendium of extra windows and doors that we've pulled off of buildings or that are extra from a sprue or something like that. And, if you look at things like these kind of, newer windows, of course, you can find bricked up buildings where something like this has actually been put into that place. And it's a great way of showing the kind of modern retrofitting that often befalls these sorts of buildings. Aside from that, anything that I get that is clear, I hang on to, particularly if it's clear and has a color or a tint to it. This is a great example. A couple of years back, I was snipping the, incorrectly green windows out of the vestibules of my Metra cars. Well, absolutely, I saved this plastic. This stuff is good as gold. Especially in industrial buildings, sometimes window panes will be replaced with what is basically fiberglass paneling or fiberglass material that has a tint to it. And so this stuff is a great way to represent that. The wood, for instance, well, I just use wood. I've always got strips of balsa hanging around, so that's basically what went into the upper story of this building in order to create the wooden board up that you see there. And then there are all sorts of other, really phenomenal options that are essentially made as applique material that can be used either in scratch building or in this particular case for bricking in windows. And so what you see here are a couple of RS laser concrete block and brick sheets. And these things are, really nice. I am always really impressed with these type of laser cut wood materials. Nowadays, I'd probably try to build every model I could out of wood, in part just because they take paint so freaking well. These things are so nice to work with and easy to handle. So that's an example. Here's another manufacturer, same kind of deal. Basically just common brick. So that's pretty useful for buildings, and I'll actually be using those for the Cassidy Tires warehouse. This is some rather interesting 3D printed, and this is HO scale, but I figure a lot of things can be transitioned down to N scale. This is from somebody who actually makes all these resin prints for steel mills, but it's basically that same kind of corrugated fiberglass paneling that you might see in the Clara story, like the upper level of a steel mill or something like that, or along the side walls. So that's pretty interesting material. There are a lot of buildings where you will actually see, particularly where they've deleted a window in order to turn it into ductwork or an HVAC room, that there might actually be foil or insulation right against the window, in which case I just use aluminum foil, and I'll actually probably do this for the Cassidy warehouse as well. And then you've got a host of modern materials on top of that. This is Plastruct, basically these kind of patterned sheets for corrugated material. This is exactly the sort of material that might go in there to reduce the size of a window. Basically you take out some window panes, put in like a frame of plywood or something like that, some insulation, and then this goes on top, and so now you've reduced the area of the window. And then of course, polystyrene. If you look at enough pictures of buildings, what you'll notice is that a lot of the random bits of window patching are colored either plexiglass or whatever material the owners of the building happen to get their hands on. And so, stuff like this green evergreen polystyrene sheeting is actually really, really useful for being able to model that type of material. The other thing you can potentially do is actually to make your own using the clear material. And in that sense, what you can do is you can get stuff like these Tamiya clear paints. You can basically dilute these down and airbrush a tint onto the polystyrene material. And that can provide kind of a nice way to, basically change the window material in a way that's useful to you. So those are just a few thoughts in terms of how best to kind of modify, or what materials can be used to modify windows and buildings in order to help create that story. And so, what that kind of means is when you think about how a building ages, or when you think about how you want to modify it, go for the windows. It's a really easy way to tell a story beyond what the shell of this thing is. And those sort of post hoc applique structures, whether it's vents, cinder block, bricking, whatever, offers a way to really enhance the visual narrative and the richness of the story that these buildings can tell. This building, if it were standing in Chicago today, would probably be a century old. If you think about what 100 years does to any particular structure, and you're modeling a more modern time, factor that in. Likewise, if you're modeling the mid-century, factor that in too. That's when a lot of these buildings really started to be modified to delete windows or add in air conditioning or other things that originally were not part of the building's structure. So it's a great way, once you have a kit already built, to start to think about how you can use windows as a way to further tell the story of a building and its neighborhood. So with all that in mind, thanks for watching this edition of Chicago Crossing and indulging my interest in windows. It's funny how sometimes working on a project will really trigger an interest in a thing that a lot of times we may well overlook. So hope to see you soon for round 2 of the modifications to the Cassidy warehouse and all the other cool stuff coming up on the layout. Take care.